I learned early that most people don't want to be understood. They want to be comforted. This realization didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived as exhaustion. I would listen carefully, instinctively, noticing the pauses people rushed past, the tension hidden inside their laughter, the way their words rarely aligned with what their bodies were saying. I didn't try to see these things. They imposed themselves on me as if reality was speaking too loudly to ignore. And for a long time, I believed this attentiveness was a way toward connection. That if I listened deeply enough, if I spoke honestly enough, something real would happen between us. It rarely did. Instead, conversations collapsed back into safety, into jokes, into repetition, into scripts everyone already knew by heart. When I followed the thread too far, when I touched meaning or doubt or contradiction, the room subtly withdrew, faces tightened, energy shifted, and without a word being spoken, I was reminded of an unspoken rule. Depth is welcome only in theory. In practice, it makes people uncomfortable. Perhaps you felt this too. That strange dissonance of being present, attentive, alive, yet slightly out of place. As if you're tuned to a frequency the room isn't receiving. You speak the same language as everyone else, but something essential fails to translate. Over time, this creates a quiet fracture inside you. Not anger, not superiority, but a growing awareness that most of the world is organized around avoiding what you cannot stop noticing. You begin to understand that society functions not on truth, but on tolerable illusions, that many people survive by smoothing reality until it no longer cuts, and that those who refuse or are unable to do this are subtly pushed to the margins. This is not the story of brilliance. It is not the myth of the misunderstood genius. It is the story of perception as burden, of awareness as isolation, of what happens to a human being who sees clearly in a world that survives by not looking too closely. And once you recognize this, you can never fully return. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not come from being abandoned, rejected, or forgotten. It emerges even in rooms full of people, in families that speak every day, in relationships that appear intact from the outside. It is the loneliness of perceiving more than can be shared, of sensing layers beneath words that others seem content to leave untouched, of realizing, slowly and without drama, that depth itself can become a separating force. I didn't always have language for this. At first, it felt like a personal flaw, a failure to relax into the world as it was presented. While others seemed able to move effortlessly through routines, conversations, and social rituals, I felt a quiet resistance inside me. Not rebellion, not superiority, just a persistent sense that something essential was being skipped, that life was being lived at a volume too low, at a depth too shallow, to register what was actually there. Philosophers have long noticed this tension between the individual who perceives deeply and the collective that prefers stability. Long before psychology named it, thinkers observed that most societies are built not around truth, but around what can be tolerated, around shared agreements that keep anxiety manageable, conflict minimal, and meaning conveniently simplified. These agreements are rarely spoken, yet everyone learns them early. Don't look too closely, don't ask too much, don't disrupt what works. For those inclined toward depth, this creates an immediate friction, not because they want to disrupt, but because they cannot help but notice. They sense contradictions where others accept coherence. They feel emotional undercurrents where others hear only words. They experience time not as a sequence of tasks, but as a weight, a question, a finite substance that demands to be used with care. This is not a choice. It is a way of being oriented toward reality. The ancient Stoics understood this well. They believed that clarity came at a cost, and that most people unconsciously trade awareness for comfort. To see clearly is not simply to know more, but to feel more responsibility for what is known. Once you notice how fragile trust is, how provisional certainty can be, how easily meaning dissolves under scrutiny, you cannot return to innocence. And innocence, however limiting, is socially rewarded. This is why deep thinkers often feel out of step with the world, not because they reject it, but because they experience it more fully than the structures around them are designed to hold. They ask questions that slow things down. They hesitate where others rush forward. They pause at moments where enthusiasm is expected, not out of negativity, but out of awareness that enthusiasm is often borrowed, rehearsed, or premature. Over time, this creates a quiet separation, not a dramatic exile, but a subtle one. The deep thinker learns that certain thoughts land awkwardly in conversation, that certain truths dampen the mood, that sincerity, when unfiltered, is often met with discomfort rather than relief. And so, they begin to edit themselves, not to deceive, but to coexist. They learn which parts of their perception to keep private and which to soften before offering them to the world. Yet even in this adaptation, the loneliness remains. Because what is withheld is not trivial. It is the core of how they experience reality. When depth has no place to go, it turns inward. It becomes contemplation, rumination, imagination, sometimes sorrow. The mind becomes both refuge and burden. Thought becomes companion and isolation at once. This is not pathology. It is not a defect. It is a structural mismatch between an inner orientation toward meaning and an outer world organized around efficiency, distraction, and surface coherence. The loneliness of deep thinkers is not caused by a lack of people, but by a lack of resonance. A sense that while many speak, few are listening at the same depth. While many connect, few connect where it truly matters. And yet, this loneliness is not without purpose. Throughout history, those who perceived deeply often stood slightly apart from the center, not because they sought distance, but because distance allowed clarity. From the margins, patterns become visible. From silence, truth becomes audible. From solitude, the self becomes intelligible. But this foundation must be laid carefully, because if loneliness is misunderstood, it hardens into resentment or pride. If depth is romanticized, it becomes an identity rather than a responsibility. The task, then, is not to escape this loneliness, nor to glorify it, but to understand it, to see it not as a verdict on one's place in the world, but as a condition that asks for discernment, patience, and inner stability. Only then can depth stop isolating and begin orienting. Only then can the deep thinker move from quiet separation toward a more deliberate way of engaging with life. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but where it is possible and where it matters. This is where the journey truly begins. At some point, the deep thinker begins to notice that their loneliness is not situational, but patterned. It follows them across environments, relationships, even phases of life. Change the city, the job, the people, and the feeling briefly softens, but it never fully disappears. This persistence is what makes it confusing. If the loneliness were merely circumstantial, it could be solved externally. But this kind resists solutions. It doesn't respond to company alone. It asks to be understood at the level of the psyche. Psychologically, deep thinkers process the world differently, not faster, not better, but more thoroughly. Where many minds filter information aggressively, discarding nuance in favor of efficiency, the deep thinker's mind lingers. It stays with impressions longer than necessary for survival. It revisits conversations after they end. It replays emotional moments not to relive them, but to extract meaning from them. This depth of processing creates insight, but it also creates saturation. The nervous system becomes attuned to subtleties others pass over. Tone shifts, inconsistencies, emotional incongruence, what someone says versus what they seem to mean. Over time, this heightened sensitivity becomes automatic. The mind no longer waits for conscious permission to analyze. It does so instinctively, continuously, even in moments meant for rest. This is where fatigue enters the picture, not physical exhaustion, but cognitive and emotional fatigue. a weariness that comes from constantly holding more information than can be shared or resolved. The deep thinker often carries unresolved impressions, not because they lack coping skills, but because many experiences do not reach closure. Conversations end without depth. Relationships plateau before honesty. Social exchanges prioritize smoothness over truth. The psyche registers these interruptions as unfinished business. To manage this overload, the mind develops strategies. One of the most common is internalization. Instead of pushing outward, challenging, correcting, probing, the deep thinker turns inward. They reflect, they analyze, they attempt to resolve complexity privately, where it won't disturb the surface harmony of the world. This inward turn is adaptive at first. It reduces conflict. It preserves relationships. It creates a sense of inner order. But over time, it also increases isolation. When too much of life is processed internally, the outer world begins to feel thin. Conversations feel repetitive. Social rituals feel performative. The deep thinker may still participate, but something essential disengages. Presence becomes partial. Attention drifts inward even while the body remains outwardly engaged. Another common strategy is emotional containment. The deep thinker learns, often unconsciously, to regulate their expression. They sense that certain emotions make others uneasy, that certain questions shift the atmosphere, that certain truths invite distance. And so they begin to compress themselves emotionally. Not by suppressing feeling, but by limiting its outward range. They become measured, calm, thoughtful, composed. From the outside, this can look like emotional stability. But internally, it often feels like compression, like holding breath, like living with a volume knob permanently turned down. The emotional world remains rich, but it is largely unshared. And unshared experience, no matter how profound, tends toward loneliness. There is also a relational pattern that emerges. Deep thinkers are often drawn into asymmetrical relationships. Because they listen well, others open up to them. Because they perceive nuance, others feel understood by them. Because they are slow to judge, others feel safe in their presence. Over time, the deep thinker becomes a container for other people's inner lives. Yet the reverse is less common. When the deep thinker attempts to express their own complexity, they often find that others lack the patience, depth, or emotional literacy to meet them there. Their experiences are not easily summarized. Their feelings resist simple reassurance. Their questions cannot be answered quickly or optimistically. This creates a subtle imbalance. The deep thinker gives depth but receives surface. They hold space but struggle to find it held for them. They become known as wise, steady, grounded, yet privately feel unseen. This imbalance reinforces loneliness. Because the deep thinker learns that connection is possible, but only in one direction. They are needed, but not fully met, valued, but not deeply understood. Over time, this can produce a quiet resignation, a sense that while relationships are meaningful, something essential remains perpetually out of reach. Psychology calls this a mismatch of attunement. Attunement is the ability to resonate with another's inner state. Deep thinkers attune easily to others, but are rarely attuned to in return. And without reciprocal attunement, intimacy becomes incomplete. Presence becomes functional rather than mutual. The result is a loneliness that persists even in closeness. This is why deep thinkers often feel most themselves when alone, not because solitude is inherently preferable, but because solitude removes the need for constant translation. Alone, there is no need to simplify perception, no need to modulate expression, no need to pause thought mid-sentence. The inner world can unfold at its natural pace, without interruption. Yet solitude, when prolonged, introduces its own risks. Without reflection, depth can spiral into rumination. Without grounding, insight can drift into abstraction. Without selective connection, loneliness can harden into identity. The deep thinker may begin to see themselves primarily as separate, different, unreachable, and this perception, once internalized, shapes future interactions before they begin. This is the psychological paradox at the center of deep thinking. Depth creates understanding, but also distance. Sensitivity fosters empathy, but also exhaustion. Awareness brings clarity, but also disillusionment. None of these are flaws, but none are neutral either. They require conscious integration, or they begin to quietly govern the inner life. The loneliness of deep thinkers, then, is not accidental. It is the psychological cost of a mind that refuses to skim, of a nervous system that registers what others edit out, of an inner orientation toward meaning in a world structured for speed. Understanding this is essential, because without understanding, loneliness feels personal. It feels like failure, like incompatibility, like a life lived slightly wrong. With understanding, it becomes contextual, structural, manageable. And once loneliness is contextualized, it can be worked with rather than endured blindly. It can be shaped into something that informs rather than isolates, something that guides rather than consumes. But this requires moving beyond explanation and into experience, beyond theory and into story, beyond abstraction and into the emotional reality of living this way. That is where we turn next. There is a moment that arrives quietly in the life of a deep thinker. It does not announce itself as a crisis. It does not arrive with drama or collapse. It appears instead as a realization so ordinary it almost goes unnoticed. It is the moment when you stop trying to explain yourself, not because you have nothing left to say, but because you have learned through repetition that what matters most to you rarely survives translation. You begin to sense, even before words leave your mouth, which thoughts will be misunderstood, which emotions will be softened into something else, which truths will be politely redirected. And so you pause, you smile, you let the moment pass. This is how the loneliness deepens, not through rejection, but through restraint. Imagine someone who walks through the world carrying a language spoken fluently inside them, yet rarely heard outside. They are not mute. They can speak when required. They can adapt vocabulary, tone, pacing. But the language that matters, the one formed by nuance, contradiction, and layered feeling, has few listeners. Over time, they stop bringing it into public spaces. They reserve it for silence. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. The deep thinker functions. They participate. They fulfill roles. They show up when expected. They are often described as calm, thoughtful, composed. But inwardly, something is missing. Not excitement, not stimulation. Resonance. Resonance is the feeling that what moves inside you can move freely between you and another. That it does not need to be edited, justified, or rushed. That it can exist without being diminished. When resonance is absent for too long, the inner life becomes heavy, not because it is painful, but because it has nowhere to go. Many deep thinkers first encounter this weight in relationships. At first, connection feels promising. There is curiosity, conversation flows, attention feels mutual. But gradually, patterns emerge. Depth is welcomed selectively. Emotional honesty is encouraged in theory, but avoided in practice. The other person enjoys being understood, but becomes uneasy when asked to understand in return. The exchange tilts. The deep thinker begins to feel that they are always standing slightly behind themselves in conversation, watching, adjusting, choosing which parts to bring forward and which to keep hidden. Not out of fear, but out of care. Care for the relationship. Care for the other person's comfort, care for the fragile balance that keeps things running smoothly, and so intimacy remains partial. Not because love is absent, but because alignment is incomplete. This is often when the deep thinker turns inward more fully, not in withdrawal, but in conservation. They begin to protect their depth the way one protects a limited resource. They stop offering it freely. They become selective, quiet, observant. Solitude begins to feel safer than misunderstanding. In solitude, there is no need to simplify emotion, no need to compress thought, no need to apologize for complexity. The mind can wander without being interrupted. Feelings can unfold without being contained. Questions can remain open without being resolved prematurely. And yet, solitude also carries a shadow. When the inner world becomes the primary place of meaning, the outer world begins to feel distant, not hostile, just thin. Conversations feel lighter than the thoughts they provoke. Experiences feel smaller than the impressions they leave behind. Life feels lived on two planes at once, one visible, one hidden. This duality creates a quiet ache. Not the ache of loneliness as absence, but the ache of loneliness as surplus. Too much perception, too much feeling, too much unshared reality. The deep thinker may begin to wonder if something is wrong with them, if they are too intense, too slow, too reflective. They may question whether their way of engaging with life is sustainable in a world that rewards speed, certainty, and optimism. And because these questions rarely find answers externally, they turn inward as well. The mind becomes both sanctuary and interrogation room. This is where the parable reaches its center. The deep thinker is not isolated because they lack connection. They are isolated because connection, as commonly practiced, does not reach the depth at which they live. They are not alone because no one is present. They are alone because presence without resonance is incomplete. This realization is painful but also clarifying. It reframes loneliness not as a personal failure, but as a signal that the inner life has outgrown the structures meant to contain it, that the psyche is asking for a different kind of engagement, a different pacing, a different standard for connection. But this clarity also introduces a difficult truth. If depth is rare and resonance rarer still, then the deep thinker must learn to live without constant validation, without frequent recognition, without easy mirrors. They must learn to hold their inner life with care, without turning it into a burden or a badge. They must learn how to carry depth without letting it isolate them entirely. This is where the narrative shifts. Because understanding the loneliness is only the beginning. The real work lies in what follows, in how one lives with this awareness without being consumed by it. That is where the uncomfortable insight emerges. There is a moment of reckoning that arrives once the deep thinker has fully understood their loneliness. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with despair. It arrives as a question, quiet, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. What if this loneliness is not only something that happens to me? What if it is also something I participate in? This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable because it turns inward. It asks the deep thinker to examine not only the world's limitations, but their own adaptations to those limitations. It asks whether depth, once protective, has quietly become a wall. When perception sharpens, discernment increases. You begin to notice not only who resonates with you, but who does not. You learn quickly which conversations feel nourishing and which feel draining. And gradually, without conscious intent, you begin to withdraw from the latter. You offer less. You engage selectively. You conserve energy. At first, this is wisdom, but over time, discernment can harden into distance. The deep thinker may begin to approach others already convinced of misunderstanding. They may enter conversations anticipating shallowness, bracing for disappointment, preparing to retreat. And expectation, when repeated often enough, becomes perception. The world begins to confirm what is already assumed. This is the subtle danger of insight without integration. Depth sharpens perception, but it can also narrow it. When you see clearly, you also see quickly. You detect patterns faster. You draw conclusions earlier. And sometimes, you stop waiting for people to surprise you. This is not arrogance. It is fatigue. After enough partial connections, enough misalignments, enough moments of speaking into silence, the psyche begins to protect itself by reducing exposure. You stop offering depth where it seems unlikely to be received. You stop extending curiosity where reciprocity feels improbable. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, loneliness becomes safer than risk. This is the paradox few talk about. The deep thinker longs for connection, yet avoids it, seeks understanding, yet withholds expression, wants to be seen, yet approaches the world already half invisible, not out of fear, but out of accumulated experience. What begins as sensitivity can become guardedness. What begins as awareness can become preemptive withdrawal. And if this goes unexamined, depth can turn inward so completely that it loses contact with life itself. Thought replaces experience. Analysis replaces presence. The inner world becomes rich, but increasingly sealed. This is not growth. It is stagnation, disguised as sophistication. Another uncomfortable truth follows. Depth does not automatically make one right. Seeing more does not guarantee seeing accurately. Sensitivity amplifies perception, but it also amplifies interpretation. When the mind is constantly reading beneath the surface, it may sometimes read too much. It may assign meaning where none was intended. It may mistake simplicity for avoidance, or ease for unconsciousness. Not everyone who lives lightly is shallow. Not everyone who avoids depth is afraid. Not everyone who prefers simplicity is asleep. Some people genuinely inhabit the surface because the surface is enough for them. Their nervous systems are not tuned to constant introspection. Their sense of meaning arises from action, routine, or immediacy rather than reflection. This is not a failure, it is a difference in orientation. When the deep thinker forgets this, loneliness becomes moralized. It turns into quiet superiority, a belief, often unconscious, that depth confers legitimacy, and that those who do not share it are somehow lesser. This belief is corrosive. It isolates further, it distorts perception, it replaces curiosity with judgment, and it creates a new kind of loneliness, one that cannot be bridged, because it refuses to be. The most dangerous illusion the deep thinker can fall into is the belief that understanding excuses disengagement, that because the world is shallow, one is justified in retreating entirely, that because connection is rare, one need not try.
This is where depth becomes self-protective rather than life-giving.
The truth is quieter and more difficult. Depth does not absolve you from relationship. Awareness does not exempt you from effort. Insight does not replace participation. If anything, it demands more of it. To see clearly is to carry responsibility, not to enlighten others, not to correct the world, but to remain open despite knowing the cost. To engage without illusion, but also without withdrawal. To risk misunderstanding without surrendering integrity. This is the real burden of depth. Not loneliness itself, but the temptation to make loneliness permanent, to turn it into identity, to build a life around avoidance disguised as discernment. The deep thinker must confront this honestly. Where have I withdrawn too early? Where have I stopped listening because I assumed I already knew? Where has my need for resonance become a refusal of difference? These questions do not invalidate loneliness. They refine it. They strip it of its self-deception and return it to something workable, something human. Because the truth is not that the world cannot meet you at your depth. The truth is that it rarely will, unless you learn when, where, and how to meet it halfway. And that requires a transformation, not of intelligence, but of orientation. That is where we go next. Transformation, for the deep thinker, does not arrive as a breakthrough. It arrives as a recalibration, a subtle shift in how one relates to the world, to others, and, most importantly, to one's own depth. The first movement of this transformation is quiet acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of resignation, but in the sense of clarity. The deep thinker begins to accept that their way of perceiving is neither a curse to be eliminated nor a gift to be displayed. It is simply the lens through which life is experienced, and every lens reveals some things while obscuring others. This acceptance changes the tone of inner dialogue. Instead of asking, why don't others see what I see? The question becomes, what does my way of seeing require of me? This is a crucial turning point, because once depth is no longer treated as an identity, it becomes a responsibility to steward one's inner life carefully, to protect it without sealing it off, to share it without demanding it be mirrored everywhere. The deep thinker begins to realize that resonance cannot be universal, that expecting it everywhere is a recipe for exhaustion. Depth must be placed deliberately, like a seed in soil capable of holding it. Not every environment is meant to sustain it. Not every relationship is designed for it. This realization brings relief. You stop asking the wrong rooms to echo your voice. Instead of interpreting every lack of resonance as rejection, you begin to see it as misplacement. Instead of feeling unseen everywhere, you start asking a more practical question. Where does my depth belong? This is not withdrawal. It is discernment without disdain. The deep thinker learns to differentiate between openness and overexposure. They understand that intimacy is not created by offering everything everywhere. It is created by offering what is appropriate, where it can be received. This shift changes how loneliness is experienced. Loneliness no longer feels like evidence of defect. It feels like a signal that depth is waiting for the right conditions, and waiting, when chosen consciously, feels different from isolation imposed unconsciously. Another element of transformation is grounding. Depth, left ungrounded, tends to drift upward, into abstraction, rumination, and endless analysis. Grounding brings it back into the body, into time, into action. It reminds the deep thinker that insight is meant to be lived, not only understood. This often means simplifying, not in thought, but in lifestyle. Choosing fewer relationships, but tending them with care. Choosing work that aligns, even if it lacks prestige. Choosing rhythms that allow reflection without indulgence. Choosing silence not as escape, but as recalibration. The deep thinker begins to recognize that meaning is not found by digging endlessly inward, but by allowing insight to shape behavior. By letting awareness inform how one shows up, how one listens, how one chooses. This is where depth becomes functional rather than isolating. The transformation is not into someone less sensitive, but into someone more anchored. Not someone less thoughtful, but someone less consumed by thought. Not someone less lonely, but someone no longer frightened by loneliness. Because loneliness, when understood, loses its power to define. It becomes a companion rather than a verdict. And from this place, a new orientation emerges, not toward people in general, but toward purpose. There is a reason depth persists even when it isolates. It is not accidental, it is not evolutionary excess. It serves a function beyond personal fulfillment. Deep thinkers often sense this intuitively, though they struggle to articulate it. They feel that their way of seeing must be for something, even if that something remains unclear. Purpose for the deep thinker is rarely found in roles or titles. It is found in orientation, in the way one moves through the world, in the quality of attention one brings to life. To see deeply is to notice what others miss, not to correct it, not to fix it, but to hold it without denial. This matters more than it appears. Every culture depends on people willing to slow down perception, to question assumptions, to feel what is inconvenient, to remember what is easily forgotten. These individuals rarely occupy the center. They operate at the edges, quietly shaping meaning rather than managing systems. The deep thinker's purpose is not to belong everywhere. It is to remain awake somewhere. This is why their presence often matters most in small, precise ways. A conversation that goes deeper than expected. A moment of honesty that interrupts pretense. A refusal to simplify something that deserves care. A silence that allows truth to surface. These moments are rarely celebrated. They do not trend. They do not scale. but they endure. The deep thinker begins to see that their loneliness has sharpened their capacity to be present when it counts. That isolation has trained them to listen without agenda. That sensitivity has taught them to recognize what is fragile. Purpose emerges not as a mission to change others, but as a commitment to remain aligned, to not betray one's perception for comfort, to not trade depth for acceptance, to not abandon meaning for ease. This is a quieter purpose than ambition, but a steadier one, and it carries an unexpected consequence. When you stop seeking resonance everywhere, you begin to find it more often. Not because the world has changed, but because your expectations have become realistic. You recognize alignment when it appears, without demanding it be constant. You stop feeling invisible because you are no longer trying to be seen by everyone. You become selective without becoming closed. And slowly, the loneliness that once felt absolute begins to soften. Not because it disappears, but because it is no longer interpreted as failure. It becomes part of the terrain. There is no cure for depth, and there is no need for one. The loneliness of deep thinkers does not vanish with understanding. It changes shape, it loses its accusation. It becomes quieter, more spacious, less personal. You come to see that every way of being carries its own solitude. Some are loud, filled with distraction and noise. Others are quiet, filled with thought and reflection. Neither is superior. They are simply different responses to existence. What matters is whether your response is conscious. The deep thinker's task is not to escape loneliness, nor to romanticize it, but to live honestly within it, to let it inform discernment without turning into avoidance, to let it deepen compassion without becoming judgment, to let it guide connection without demanding symmetry. You were never meant to be understood everywhere. You were meant to understand deeply somewhere. And perhaps in time to offer that understanding carefully, patiently, without insisting it be returned in the same form. This is not resignation. It is orientation, a way of standing in the world without distortion, a way of seeing without turning away, a way of living that does not deny complexity, but does not drown in it either. The loneliness remains, but it no longer defines you. It simply walks beside you, reminding you to choose depth where it can live, silence where it must, and presence where it matters most. And that is enough.